we had just discussed the different stages of societies, beginning from the foraging, the pastoral societies, industrial and agriculture and pastoral, industrial societies. And in these stages of societies, we happen to witness as the members of the society increases, it move on from simple to a more complex form of in relationship. So, in a sense, we can presume that there is an increase in terms of the division of labor, which is more based on a specialized and skilled of the individuals. As we can see here, members start to engage more in a different specialized roles. Now, perhaps this specialization is more vivid and more clear in the industrial societies, because this division of labor is based more or less on the level of expertise which an individual has. Now, this division of labor perhaps has been strongly discussed by Durkheim, which of course we won't be covering in this course, but Durkheim tries to divide the differences between mechanical and organic solidarity, and wherein he says in most of the simple and traditional societies, the relationships shared among the members were more or less being mechanic, and rather in the industrial and post-industrial society, the kind of solidarity which a group usually maintain is more or less organic in nature. Now, as a result of this, there is a shift from more of a movement from a military to an industrial society. And now, what happens in a military form of society? More or less, it is based on a compulsion and a compulsory kind of cooperation of its members. You know how the military functions, right? Now, depending on that, this form of relationship usually is maintained by a compulsive kind of cooperation, which is expected from the members of the group. And secondly, the industrial society is also characterized by the voluntary cooperation of its members. There is differences between the military and the industrial, because in the industrial it is more or less based on voluntary, whereas in the military it is more or less based on the compulsory cooperation, which is expected from the members of the society. And thirdly, when society in a sense reach the stage of an ethical state, common resources in a sense may be part of the human character. In a sense, they have reached a stage of perfection. Now, in this, if you look at this, the structural parts of how this society functions, for example, let us take an example of a families, how they functioned. They functions more or less in a independent manner. They work in a more independently, and therefore, this social structure in a sense work together in order to preserve or maintain the society. Therefore, the social fabric of the society is being stabilized based on this function. Now, moving on, as we had discussed the successive stages of society, we will partly try to look into how the production, the modes of productions operates. Now, for instance, humans usually are based on, usually guided by the basic needs, and these basic needs in a sense is central to our ways of life or maybe a social life, and partly these basic needs or guiding principles is true in almost every forms of society, be it the contemporary or modern period or maybe be it the prehistoric period. Now, in some way or the other, these sort of basic needs has been something which society has been after. Now, what is this quest to meet these basic needs? Because normally these are based on the primary goals and which is being central to the attempts of human life, and which of course more and more these basic needs shift and evolve. So is the society, which in a sense move on from simple to compound and a more of a complex kind of society. Now, usually when these basic needs are met, these often create to the quest or yearning for further needs, which means it shifts and it moves on because there is no limit to it. Therefore, human by nature in a sense is greedy, and then we tend to yearn for more and more. And in this process, humans struggled against nature to satisfy, if not gratify one's needs. Now, therefore, we tend to involve in certain kind of exploitation and abuse of nature, which is being part of the ball game in a social social structure, which is part of inherent in the successive stages of society, and which I feel that to me this might perhaps be one of the reasons why we have witnessed or encountered this ecological crisis, and partly which perhaps might be pushed forward by the industrialization process, and also because of the capitalist mode of production, because we all know in capitalist mode of production goods and goods are produced, and you tend to find avenue to sell of those goods. Now, that is how with that kind of intention and with this guide by this kind of economic mode of production, the resources which perhaps has been there to sustain the basic needs of human have been to some extent been more exploited in a wider and then in a fast paced manner. Now, as we had discussed in the previous slides, we in a sense tries to delve into how this ecology and what ecology is trying to engage and look upon, because ecology, no doubt, as we by now I assume that you all know what ecology is. It is the interactions or interrelationship which are being shared by the living beings, or maybe the biotic or a non-biotic in the environment. And cultural ecologies in a sense is engaged in trying to record part of the traditional knowledge that is valued to the wider world. Now, cultural ecology in a sense is generally included within the discipline of anthropology, and that is anthropology is a discipline which studies human beings or the human society. Now, what does anthropology, the discipline of anthropology look at? Let me just give a brief introduction to what anthropology is and then what the discipline of anthropology looked at. The study of anthropology includes the study of human biology, language, prehistory, religion, social structure, economics, evolutions, and anything else that applies to people. Now, you can actually break up all this, because perhaps if you talk about culture, you can talk about the material culture, non-material culture, and within religion, belief, rituals, ceremonies. Now, these are some of the branches, or so to say, the wider topics which are being usually covered within the study of anthropology. And usually, people who are engaged in studying anthropology, or maybe who are an anthropologist, engaged in concentrating their work mostly on the small scale or simple societies or cultures, and tend to have more of a personal contact with the people of those cultures. By saying a personal contact, we mean to say they are usually being guided by the research methods such as ethnography. Now, in ethnographic study, what people do is usually they conduct a research or field work in societies which are in a sense alien to them. Now, there are some anthropologists who have like Malinowski, Evans Pritchard. Now, they in a sense engage in an ethnographic study in a more longer period, which is also known as longitudinal study. Now, they tends to take into account almost every nitty-gritty part of their culture, and through this engagement, they are able to interpret the hidden meanings which usually an outsiders can't make sense of it. Now, that's perhaps is one of the advantage of being an anthropologist and the kind of tools and techniques which are being used in the study of any society, or for that matter, because it begins with trying to look at small scale if not simple societies. Now, traditionally what anthropologists looked at is study the set of basic beliefs which usually is in the setting which is outside the domain of one's culture. Now, since an anthropologist is trying to look at or study a culture of a different society, usually he or she encounters these ethnocentric feelings, that is, people normally engage in believing that culture, that their own culture is superior than others, and this kind of ethnocentric or ethnocentrism is developed as a result of one's own process of socialization. Now, for instance, you can have a look at the examples which I have given here. Now, Americans usually tends to view the non-American as being inferior, which are less civilized, and similarly you have that kind of feeling. For instance, the Germans during the period of Hitler tends to see themselves as a pure race of the Aryan blood, and they have that anti-Semitic feelings against the Jews. Now, these are part and parcel reality which exist in humans' minds when they tends to compare with other groups of society. Now, another conviction which an anthropologist encounter is that cultural relativism, that is, you tends to judge the culture and cultural practices of others based on your cultural belief and practices. Now, we have partly discussed the successive stages of society and also how societies move on from more simple to complex one. Now, we will try to shift into a different topic now, which I feel is important and which I put it as a cultural ecological theory. And in this, we will try to look into the sociocultural materialism, which is being posited by Mervyn Harris, and how does he tries to make sense of the sort of action or how an individual or society engage into some kind of action, and we will try to bring in the kind of social action which was discussed by Max Weber, another German sociologist. Now, what then is a cultural ecological theory? A theory, to begin with, is nothing but a worldview. You form some kind of an idea, a concept, and through that you are trying to look at things, and you tend to in a sense test it, validate it, and based on that findings you develop some kind of a theory. Now, usually in these exercises it involves what or observation, which of course is pretty much being used in social sciences and of course in the discipline of anthropology. Now, in these exercises you tends to engage in looking at the origins, maintenance and change. Now, what then is sociocultural materialism? Now, in this section we will try to address or examine the society from the lens of a sociocultural materialism, and sociocultural materialism is a theory of sociocultural system, and as I said, it is a variant which is being borrowed from Mervyn Harris. Now, let us try to assume, because a theory in a sense is also being hypothesized, the worldview before you have the real contact with the real world. You tend to hypothesize certain elements which in a sense guide you to interpret and make sense of what you observe. Now, for instance, what the first assumptions which in a sense would guide us is how the various parts of societies are interrelated. Now, it is quite interesting to see that how the parts of our body make a single body, but then similarly the parts of our body in a sense are interrelated and being representing the whole or one single body. Now, similarly we have different members, different groups who actually forms the larger single society, and how is this interrelated, and what are the kinds of functions which these members of the society are being interrelated. Now, for instance, over here I gave an example of an institution such as family cannot be looked at in isolation. Therefore, it is important to discuss or look at the economic, the political, the social, religious institution within which a family functions. Therefore, let us presume that when one part of the society changes, it also have an impact on other parts of the society, and then definitely if one part changes, the other part is also going to change. Now, the intensity of that change might be different. In some it might be minimal, and in some it might be much more higher. Now, since the course is to deal with ecology or environment, therefore, let us also assume that the environmental base what we have, what human societies are interrelated. In a sense, our action, that is human action, does have an impact on the environment. Now, as we begin, humans are usually guided to fulfill their quest for their basic needs. Now, if we try to see society as which are interrelated parts, then obviously there will be some sort of an organizing principles. That organizing principles will be sort of an integrating force which guide the members of the society. Now, for instance, the way how a society is organized to meet certain requirements, the requirements can be infrastructure, it can be superstructure. Now, usually based on that, the society tends to shape, that is the population tends to shape or set the system. Now, if we take the examples of the Hindu caste system, the caste system which prevailed earlier was more or less based on the Varna system, wherein a particular group is engaged in a certain kind of occupation. Now, over a period of time, that sort of division becomes rigid and it becomes more of a structure, if not part of the Hindu caste system. Now, prior to what we have now or what is being encountered today, during that period of the Varna system, society in a sense engaged in forming a system in order to meet or to stabilize their structure of society based on different functions, right. Now, a certain group of people were engaged in agriculture work, certain in the work blacksmithy, and then certain sections to be in the war front, and some groups who are usually engaged in more of ritual ceremonies and religious practices. Now, over a period of time, that kind of profession becomes more of ascriptive, which the family or the caste group tends to rigidify. That is how society is being stratified or being divided, I would rather say, in order to fulfill the kind of needs which we have. Now, what is the environmental constraints which human society usually encounter? Now, the first and foremost is the natural resources, which is very important in order to sustain, if not fulfilled, the basic needs of human. Now, why is this natural resources so much important? Because the availability of natural resources might not be similar in every part of the world, and so is the carrying capacity. Now, if we take examples of say pollution, which of course is being created by humans through certain kinds of activities, maybe the industry or maybe the kind of automobiles which we use. Now, these are directly or indirectly responsible for the kind of environmental mess we create, that is pollution. Now, how do we as a human tries to overcome and encounter this kind of problems? Because we tend to engage in finding an alternative way to modify these constraints, because we can't escape. So, we will have to find a different way of an alternative way, which I would say the adaptive mechanism of the environmental constraints. Now, human societies in successive stages has come up with a different kind of adaptive mechanism in order to sustain, if not adapt or adjust with the environment. Now, similarly, the present contemporary period is also witnessing like issues like climate change, the ozone depletion. Now, in a global forum, there has been different initiative taken by different regions. What could have perhaps be the possible solutions? Now, when we discuss about what the infrastructural needs of humans, now human usually encounters the interface of the sociocultural systems and environment, and it is through this interface the infrastructure that society tends to utilize or manipulate its environment by modifying the types of resources which actually is being needed. Now, usually we in the previous lectures we have discussed how these resources is being controlled, if not the distribution of resources is not equally distributed, and this perhaps bring some kind of an environmental injustice to different communities. Now, based on this idea, one needs to engage in trying to find out, if not the amount of consumptions which usually is required by a group needs to be in a sense evaluated. Now, the infrastructure which I discuss here consists of two parts, that is the mode of production and reproduction. So, in a way we can say it is the consumer and the provider. This interface is part and parcel of the ecosystem, wherein sometime when the consumer is much more higher than the provider, then a situation of imbalance also crop up. Now, over here what is the mode of production and what is the reproduction? The mode of production and reproduction in a sense attempts to strike a balance, because unless there is a balance between the two, there will be definitely a collapse, if not a destruction. Now, for instance, consumption of energy, for instance, usually if a particular community, for example, rely on fuel, wood and fodder in a particular geographical area. Now, they have in a sense been managing, because this it also gives a space or a time for regeneration. Now, if that resources is being exploited through some external forces, maybe which is driven by the so called market economy. Now, that might perhaps lead to a faster pace of destruction, and there is an imbalance between the kind of dependence and mode of production and that reproduction. Now, that becomes imbalance. Now, what is mode of production then? It in a sense consists of a part and parcel action of humans which tries to fulfill the requirements of subsistence, or so to say the basic needs. Now, in this we tend to engage in looking at the technology of the subsistence and the technological and at the same time the environmental relationship. Now, why is this technology and environment interrelated? Because the more finer and the more advanced is the technology we used, in a sense it poses a threat to the environment, if not the kind of relationship which humans share with the environment changes. Now, I am just trying to partly highlight which more or less we have discussed already in the previous slides. Now, how is this mode of production usually being classified or divided by mostly the anthropologists and sociologists, and in this successive stages of society we have a different form of sociocultural system. Now, for instance, in hunting and gathering society, the sociocultural system might not be same as the horticulture, pastoral if not agrarian and the industrial, because if you compare the previous four with the last one, that is the industrial society, we tend to see that there is more of a specialized and division of labor based on skills, because the interrelationship or the parts of society becomes much more finer in the kind of jobs or profession which they are engaged. Now, perhaps the system of bureaucratization or bureaucratic nature work which is guiding us in the present times perhaps will be the best suited example how this part of the sociocultural system or the working culture has changed over a period of time. Now, it also consists of, in a sense, the behavior which actually is being aimed at controlling the whole members of the society. And for instance, if we pick the hunting and gathering society, what will they do or what will they engage into if they run out of a food stock, for example. Now, it is upon this environmental infrastructural foundation that the remaining parts of the social systems are going to be decided upon. Now, that is one of the reasons why the environmental infrastructure tends to hold key positions in the interface of the human and environment. Now, if you look at the social system, you can break up by looking at some of these sub points, like for instance demography, the mating patterns, fertility, natality, or maybe the modern forms of what contraception, abortions and infanticides. Let us assume that these are part of what the social system is and what are the kind of changes which are being witnessed. Now, for instance, what then is social structure? It refers to the human groups and organizations, and the social structure of human society can be perhaps divided into two, that is the primary and secondary groups. Now, what is these primary groups? It is more to do with the consisting of small group of members of the society, maybe in the family, or which usually regulate a face to face kind of contact in their exchange and consumptions, more or less in the domestic settings. And usually this relationship which is being shared in these primary groups are more intimate, and as I said, it is more of encounter, I mean mutual encounter takes place physically. Now, these are some of the groups which can be classified within the primary groups, that is the family, the community, and within this maybe some voluntary groups and some religious group, or maybe your friends, the kind of circle you have within your peer groups. Now, in secondary organizations, what do we have? We have much more of a formalized kind of relationship, wherein the groups in the members in the groups are being guided by certain rules and regulations, right? Now, that sort of relationship is formal in nature. Now, for instance, the institutions like the government, military, police, corporations, education, media, so on and so forth, can actually be put under these secondary organizations. Now, what is the need, why is the need for discussing this bureaucratization? Now, this very term which is being to an extent discussed by Max Weber in his trying to posit about the kind of social changes or how the social functions changes in the industrial post industrial society, and perhaps in his quest to elaborate and understand more of this rationalization of this accent, he perhaps tends to see this bureaucratization as one of the most base forms of this modern society. Now, what do we have in this bureaucratization? It the course of human evolution, that is the successive stage of in societies, how division is being labor is being divided, and how are the members of the society being divided. As we had discussed, there is an increasing division of labor, that is from the more unspecialized to in a more specialized, or from a more simple to a complex one. And then this distribution or allocation of whatever is based on the psychological need and satisfaction. And within this, there emerges a class called elites. Who are these elites? I will come back to the bureaucratization in the later part, but for the time being, let us look at what the elite is. It is based on the class, sex, race, and then the status which usually exists throughout the structure of society. Now, in almost every society, there will be a class who are being in the upper layer of the society, and which are considered to be much more garnering a lot of power, and these power elites in a sense might not be generalized, and it might be different in across different societies. This why is the prevalence or the existence of elites in a sense is necessary, or what are the socio-cultural system which in a sense bring them into existence. Now, usually because of the power relationship, if not unequal distribution of wealth, one section of the society tends to be much more in an advantageous position, and then they tends to take control of the socio-economic, if not the political system, and they happens to have enjoyed that particular status. Now, in what I have discussed in the previous slides, human needs infrastructure and also superstructure. Now, what is the differences between the two? Now, if you look at the superstructure, which actually can also be further divided into two, that is the cultural and the mental. Now, the mental is more of psychological, and it in a sense is also responsible for guiding human to engage in a certain kind of action. Now, what does this cultural superstructure includes? The recreation activities, art, sports, empirical knowledge, folklore and other aesthetics products, and also maybe the music, dance, rituals. So, all these are part of the cultural superstructure, which is embedded within a particular socio-cultural system of any society. Now, the mental structures are more to do with an individual's values, emotions, traditions and work rationale. Now, how is these two in a sense interrelated? Because an individual in a sense cannot act or function in isolation, rather within the socio-cultural setting of a society. Therefore, it is important to look at how this individual, or that is the mental structure, functions. Now, Max Weber, a German sociologist, posits the idea that there are four basic motivators for human behavior, because a human, the whole body is also being influenced by certain kind of motivations, that is our interest to pursue a specific task or goal. Now, ideal types is an actual behavior which is motivated by combination. Now, the first type of this behavior, which in a sense motivate the human, is the value oriented behavior. What is this value oriented behavior then? It is an action which is being guided by a value. Now, you tend to pursue a goal which you feel that it has more value. The value can be more, it can be based on, for example, if an individual attends a college because he values the life of the mind, or maybe for knowledge sake, he wants to be an enlightened or an educated person, therefore, he attends a college or pursue education. So, therefore, that can be categorized as a behavior which is being motivated by a value. So, also doing the right thing out of religious or philosophical ideas
of right and wrong. That is, we humans are guided by certain kind of conscience. Now, based on the kind of religious upbringing or teachings which we normally encounter and experience in life, we tends to like avoid certain elements such as doing or not engaging in an evil or doing some to commit certain crime. Now, that can also be part of this value oriented behavior. And the second is the rational action, which is in relation to a value. Now, for instance, carrying forward that examples which we have cited, now attending a college because you value the life of the mind, so in a way can be cited as again another example. Now, the second thing is how is this the effective or emotional effective, that is the emotional of human guide one's behavior. Now, normally we humans differ in terms of our reactions. Sometimes we are pretty much being reactive when we are in a condition of anger or when we are happy. So, we are not able to hide in a sense our emotions. So, that in that instances we becomes more reactive, and perhaps that particular expression or action might not serve any purposes. Now, for instance, you attend a college for a good time or because your significant other attends, or maybe because you are attracted to someone, or maybe you happens to be in love with someone, and then that may be the prime reason why you simply go and attend colleges. Now, those sort of behavior which are being guided by affective or emotions can be categorized under these examples. Now, the next is the traditional behavior. How is a behavior in a sense influenced by one's tradition? Now, usually we have these customs and traditions, if not norms and values, which are pretty much embedded to every members by their group. Now, and these customs and traditions usually guide us, if not enabled human to engage in certain kinds of action, which in essence can be maybe considered as a privilege, or maybe which is considered to be more of appreciated by the society. Now, for instance, maybe if you take the examples of the girl child education in the Indian context, for example. Now, educated parents normally encourage irrespective of gender to engage in pursuing education. Now, mostly in rural areas where parents are uneducated, they might not get the same preference of treatment, or mostly in a patriarchal kind of society, women are seen to be much more of as a domestic helper, and they might lose the chance of to attend or pursue any kind of education. Now, whatsoever it is, these are actions which are usually being guided by the rules and norms, or if not the belief which the society has. Now, this last one, that is the vague rational, how it does guide the behavior and action of man. This is a rational action wherein individual is guided by a specific goal. That is, you tend to engage in pursuing or your action is guided by a rational goal. Now, depending on that, you tend to build certain uh, ways to achieve that goal. Now, for example, your purpose of attending the college, as we had discussed in the examples, might not necessarily be based on your emotions or just because you are in love with someone, or maybe you value education, or maybe your family members had that traditions of getting education. So, apart from that, keeping aside all those, now your purpose of attending a college or getting education is to get a job. So, you set a certain kind of goal, and this particular goal Weber has categorized it as the rational action, or which is also known as vec rational. Now, there is another example which I gave here. For example, building a raft to cross a river, studying to get a good grade. Now, there will be different kind of actions or purposes which human might engage into. So, it might be short term, it might be long term. Now, depending on that, we humans engage into pursuing or engage into that behavior. Now, what Weber noticed as a curious phenomenon in this vague rational behavior is because there is an increasingly dominations of these sorts of behavior. Now, why is this so? Because we humans are guided by a certain kind of interest. Now, perhaps we can say this interest can be infrastructural determinism. Now, what is this infrastructural determinism? Now, in a sense, this is one of the major principles of sociocultural materialism, and in this, the mode of production, in a sense, and the reproduction determined the primary and secondary group structure which we have discussed, the kind of relations which are being shared by members of the society, which in a sense also determined the cultural and mental superstructure. Now, all this cannot be seen as in isolation, rather it is in some way or the other interrelated. Now, what is infrastructural determinism then? Now, one of the rationales behind giving certain priorities in life is through these infrastructural practices that in essence society usually adapts to its environment, because we tend to find a way how to adjust and adapt to the environment, and through which we engage in different kind of economic activities, so to say, or modes of production. Now, for instance, if I give an example of a cultural community who engage in shifting cultivation, if not zooming. Now, from the perspective of the mainstream or dominant ideas, those practices might be or termed as which is harmful or not really environmental friendly. Now, but from the perspective of those who practices this, so to say, shifting cultivation, might be in a sense the best way how they adapt to their environment. And secondly, could be because the kind of geographical terrain which they inhabit might be conducive for that kind of agricultural practices. So, in a way, I am just citing an example of that because society adapts to its environment, that is the infrastructure practices in a sense is also being guided by the environment. So, in a way it is the environment which in a sense influences the society, and in return the society tends to engage in these infrastructural practices depending on the environment which they are into. Now, it is through this infrastructure that society moves on, that is the mode of production, and it modifies in a sense the amount and types of resources required for life. Now, what resources are we talking about here? It talks about the amount of or the kind of basic needs which humans usually feel that they require in order for subsistence. Now, since these infrastructural practices are essential for human existence, these widespread structural and superstructural patterns must in a way be balanced, that is, it should be compatible with them. Now, the intensification which is being witnessed globally, if you look at the, because of the world population, infrastructural industrial infrastructure are growing at an exponential rate. Now, obviously, this will have a far-reaching or a pressure on the environment, that is the resources, and this growth or intensification has impact on other parts of the system. As we had discussed in the beginning, now if there is a change in one part of the society, and obviously there will be a change in other parts. So, similarly your action, what you are engaged into, definitely will have an imprint or a change on the overall system. Now, coming back to what bureaucratization is, if we try to link up with the idea of this intensification. Now, intensification of infrastructure in a sense causes the growth of secondary organizations at the expense of primary groups. Now, what then is how is this being intensified? This intensification process of the secondary group at the expense of smaller group is being realized, because the intensification of infrastructure and bureaucratization of the structure cause the superstructure to rationalize. That is, their action, whatever they do, is considered to be rationalized. Now, the increasing dominance of goal oriented rational behavior at the expense of behavior guided by values, traditions and emotions. Now, this is the meaning of what rationalization is, which means your action is guided by achieving the goal, and in the process you compromise and you ignore the values, traditions and emotions. So, by and large, which means rationalization is nothing but it is an action which is guided by a wasted interest to reach or achieve a particular goal. Now, in this, while discussing what the infrastructure is, if infrastructure becomes a primary importance, the structure and superstructure in a way are not just a mere reflection of the infrastructural processes, but are in interaction with this process. And societies become very stable, and the most likely outcome would be change in the system, that is in resistance to other sectors of the society. Now, this is something which would eventually be observed in the case of this when rationalization is into action. Now, we can partly look at the possible outcome, that is to assess the outcome of this behavior or action. The result is either the extinctions or maybe the destruction or of the preserved and fundamental character of the whole system. Now, one of the example is, for instance, income tax, women's liberation, commune movement. Now, all this kind of social engagement or action in a sense will bring a change to the whole, that is it will bring an institutional change or to reframe the existing norms and values which a society have been into it. Now, for instance, you can have a general observation or assessment how this socio-cultural change release the energy from the environment is likely to be swiftly adopted. Now, in a sense, there is this correlationship which exists among all these. Now, infrastructural and environment relationship are also central in explaining the socio-cultural change. Now, how is this infrastructure and environment interrelated in trying to look at or explain the socio-cultural change? Because we also need to recognize the importance of structures and superstructures in trying to sort of determine the speed and character of change. It rather allows us to understand the speed and pace of change, how changes are moving on. Is it in the fast pace or in a slow pace? Now, it is through this infrastructure that humans are taking leaps. Now, if they move in a faster rate, which means the technology is much more finer and that allows humans to move in a much more faster pace. Now, what is in this? What is the role of the elites? What is the role of elites in this whole game? Now, the changes which normally encounter in the socio-cultural setting, the elites are able to impose sort of direct economic and political sanctions to get their way or maybe to serve their purpose, because they have their own vested interest, and through this they usually engage in encouraging their or imposing their ideas and ideologies which are favorable to their position. Now, as a human, we tend to be insecure or maybe to move out from the kind of position which we have. Now, since they are in a way insecure, they have to sort of impose certain set of rules in order to serve their interests and purposes. Now, what is the socio-cultural materialism which I had mentioned when we discuss, which I borrowed from Marvin Harris? Socio-cultural materialism is in a sense in fundamental agreement with Marx when he states the ideas of the ruling class in each period are the ruling ideas. The ruling ideas, that is, Marx when he talked about dialectical materialism, and he happens to argue that in each and every successive stage or in every society there is a ruling class, and this ruling class tends to in a sense controlled by imposing their ideas. Now, in a sense, while discussing this sociocultural materialism, it is also important to recall the historical materialisms of Marx. Now, which I won't be discussing in detail in this course and lecture. So, maybe if someone is interested in looking more into the dialectical, if not historical materialism of Marx, so you can Google it, and then there will be plenty of articles and materials on that. Now, how does this elite tends to control their power then across societies? Because they have that idea, as Marx had rightly pointed out, the ruling class, or in a sense in every societies, impose certain kind of ideas, that is, they rule through the ideas which are made to believe to the other masses, right. Now, that is how you tends to impose certain ideas on others, and that very idea is in a sense instrumental in ruling them. Now, if we talk about that idea of the ruling class, if we take examples of the French society prior to the French Revolution, the French society, I mean the citizens of France were made to believe that the king, their king was he has that guided by the idea of divine right theory, which means he in a sense is a representation of God. Now, whatever he says, he is the law. Now, that kind of ideas in a sense usually is being imposed on certain societies, and if this idea is sort of being followed and abide by any members, then that is how the ruling elites tends to play with, in a sense, their ideas. Now, in every society, if you look at, there is this the dominant class that in a sense tends to have a disproportionate amount of wealth and social power. And in this socio-cultural materialism, it is important to make an analysis and attempt to understand or identify this class, who are this class, who have this disproportionate amount of social power, and then why is it that they have that kind of power. So, which in essence has to be sort of analyzed and understood in that particular social system. Thank you.